main themes of current politics is the denial
Remember that for women, men are race, and this hasn't really been mentioned or that much. We've been together, so I felt that it was something to bring up.
Richard invited me to speak about strangers from the deep, and it's very good for an artist, I think, to have to try and talk about the work in a different context. So I hope tonight, for those of you who know the work and have heard me speak before, I might speak about it in a new way. And I'm going to try and show some new works which people from Boston mightn't have seen before, so it's not all the same stuff. The older you get, the harder it is to speak about your work because there's too much to speak about. And it's very, very it gets more difficult, actually. So forgive me if I rattle on and sound repetitive. But I hope that the strange notion will make me consider it in a different way. Because a lot of people think my work is strange. I don't, because it becomes terribly familiar. But it's an interesting territory. Could you show the first video? Thanks very much. I'm going to just show you the first 2 minutes of the documentary called About Beauty. When you're diving, especially in blue water, there's a fantastic thing that occurs depending on visibility, where sharks come through the blue towards you, and very often they investigate you and depart. But there's this point of blue perception where you're not sure you see it or not, where the blues merge, and it's a fantastic point where imagination and reality merge. And that's something that I think epitomizes visual art in a way. Beauty is uncertainty. So I'm beginning with an old piece of work, which was an untitled photograph I made where I inset a fetal skeleton into the brain space of a human skull. And when Richard invited me to talk about that notion of the strangeness from the depths, in some sense, the strangest thing is our own existence. And for me, this piece kind of sums up that in a bodily way. You know, we come in terms of our own body, and then we come in terms of our own mind. And this is a self-portrait I did when I was maybe about 25 years ago. And I was looking at it when I was going through my files and realizing that it is about a kind of it's about an intellectual notion of striving, but it's also overlaid with, it's in fact a dogfish, not a shark. But it shows the kind of futility and problematic human attempt to strive towards something, which in some sense is animal. But the dogfish, actually, if you look closely, I was thinking about this the other day, is tied by a string to the wall. So it is all about limitations. And the thing I feel very much in terms of visual art is that we are incredibly limited. So when something sparks in the brain that is new and surprising and essentially strange, that is the kernel and the crystal that creates art or some process towards trying to transform something or present something in a new way. I just brought some slides of where I live. I was brought up in the south of Ireland in Cork, but about 7 years ago I moved from Dublin to live on the west coast, and this is the end of my land that I go to every morning, and I work just about 100 yards up the field. And this in some ways explains a lot of my new work, because my territory are these beaches that I walk on and I find stuff and I bring it back and sometimes use it in art. And this is the carcass of a Cuvier's whale that I found that was very decayed. And generally when they land on a beach, they get removed by the county council because they smell too bad and people think it's inappropriate to have a smelly thing on a beach. So I got to this earlier than the council and got my farmer neighbour to carry it up to my land. But I'm just showing this because the neighbours behind the hedges, they were going, John has a new digger and John has a whale on his new digger. It was this very strange kind of half watchful journey for 3 miles up to my field. But what I love about it is it's a material that is pure nature. It was really disgusting. It took a year to decay. I put it down on my cliff and the birds didn't even eat it. It was so disgusting. But I knew that the prevailing winds would blow the smell out to sea and that nobody would complain, and it was far enough from the road. But what I generally do with the kind of discovery of something is try to relocate it or reconfigure. And this is a little girl called Lara who lives down the road, and she's a wise child. And she doesn't question. I said, Lara, will you hold that whalebone and I'll take some photographs? And she holds a whalebone. And what I love about it is that the kind of innocence and ancient quality between the two things. And photography is a fantastically fast tool for that type of endeavour. We're jumping back to 1988 now, and this was a show I did in the Douglas Hyde in Trinity College in Dublin, and it was called Ebb, and it was the first kind of major show I was given to do, and it's a wonderful space that you enter in from above. And these characters, I refer to them as characters, were all kind of invaded by oceanic kind of elements, fish elements, like a shark fin or a shark lady in a ball dress. And looking back on it now, it was I had just read John Updike's Couples and I loved it. And I was trying to kind of reenact some notion of the human relationships, like going to a cocktail party, and some kind of strangeness. There was very much a construction. In those days, I spent hours and hours and hours building these things out of thin plywood and making a kind of a theatre that the viewer entered down this little pier and kind of mingled with the structures. But it was very much about the notion of the removal of water, seeing something for a short period of time, and then possibly the tide coming in again. So maybe the relationships of all those sculptures would be different the next day. And this was a trip I made last year to an island in the South Pacific called New Ireland. And it was a Tantalus, really. I heard of the name of the island and thought how fantastic and how abominable at the same time, colonization and naming. It was named by a British captain who sailed down there in the 17th century. He said, that's New Ireland, that's New Britain, that's New Hanover. And he sailed past. And at the same time, I heard of a practice called shark calling, that the natives on the island believe that their ancestors, through ritual, song, and will guide them to the shark and guide the shark to them. They go out in these dugout canoes, they use rattles and song, and they lure the sharks up from the depths. And it actually works. It's very, very deep off these islands. And it's a very male practice, but I went there to try and film them. And this is a man called Shogang, who is a younger shark caller. He's about 37, and he's probably the last of the village who believe in the ritual of it. There are 1 or 2 men who think it's going to be tourism, but only 1 tourist had ever visited the village in the year previous to us getting there. There are no roads, there's no running water, there's no electricity, there's nothing. It's to my mind, being a Western person, a treasure of a place that's just on the brink of having a road built to the other side of the island, which will change it enormously. But what I felt about the place, and this man is called Selam Karasambe, and he was filmed by Cousteau in the 80s and by an Australian man. And I had researched films about him and seen him as a young man. And when I arrived in the village, he was still there, but he had been excluded by the young men. But I immediately went up to him. They speak English because they were colonized. And he had been almost kind of put aside. But he's a real magic man and is the heart of this fantastic place where they live between ocean and garden. And it's literally that. They grow their vegetables up in the jungle and they fish on the reef. So I spent most of my time with him. And in a moment I'll show you the piece of work that we made from it. But just to fill you in a little bit of the place, you know, the girls would bring me these flying foxes for dinner. And they shot them with little, catapults. And this was a woman who peeled her potatoes with a beautiful shell. It was such a fantastically open place. You arrived and they sang on the reefs. They sang in harmony. You thought, where's the movie camera? Where's Marlon Brando? You know, all that kind of cynicism and kind of presumption of us from the West was with us. But then when you go out 3 miles offshore, Selam allowed me go in his canoe, but he gave me leaves from the jungle that I had to wash my body with the night, at dawn before going out, because women bring bad luck to the sharks. And in fact, we didn't catch a shark. And I said to him, is it because I was in the canoe? And he said, probably. But this was the beauty and strangeness, but the kind of daily existence of this. Like, he took his T-shirt and put it on his head. You're talking Vogue magazine meets, the most primitive, kind of considered thing in the world. Which is a kind of a natural, it's a natural art, which I'll speak about later in terms of a visit to the Galapagos. But they eat beetle nuts in between catching a shark. He's having his beetle nut and he's going back into land. Ritesh, could you show the video now? I'm just going to show you one section of video, which will make sense in a minute when I show you the next show, of a man called Selam singing a song. What I did was I asked him, could I interview him? And then he started to sing this song. And you'll see what happens.
Kasi linomano su balama ay balama ranggit niya ubeng kakano no linom nga tasi linom ba no su.
It's heartbreaking to watch that, but basically what Selam was doing, he sang that song to camera. I saw that he was beginning to cry, and I gestured, would I stop filming, and he put his hand up and he wanted to sing this song. This is a song he normally sang when he was out at sea and he had caught a shark, and it was a song of thanks to the shark and to his ancestors. And he had never ever sung it on land before, or ever to anybody before. And I said, why are you crying? And he said, I believe the whole cycle and natural process of shark calling is dying, the ritual of shark calling. And for me, I felt he wanted to mark that sadness, because he knows that life is changing, and that this kind of balance that exists in his life will be gone for the next generation. But what we do as tourists is think this is strange that people go out and use rattles and catch a shark. But what I love is that it's a normality at the same time, and that closeness to nature, which Robin spoke about so beautifully earlier, and I wish I could speak so beautifully about, is essentially what life is about in a way. So when I came back to Ireland, I made a show in the gallery I show in Dublin called the Curlin Gallery, and I called it Sapiens or Sapiens, which is the root of Homo sapiens, which comes from the word wisdom in Latin, sapiens. And it's always kind of vaguely amused me and disgusted me that we've had the arrogance to call ourselves wise. So I was trying to look at that notion in relationship to this show. And this piece was called Sapiens itself, and it's a cast of a human skull in bronze, and growing out of the back of the head is a little fetal skeleton cast in bronze also. And it ties in a bit with the first image you saw of the skeleton in the brain space, because in some sense it's about a potential rebirthing. It's about it's about imagination and creativity, but it's also about death, which is inherent in all of that. And putting it on the tripod in a way, in terms of kind of speculative vision or whatever, or an instrument of discovery, was kind of important. And in the gallery, we projected Selam on the far wall, and above it, I found this boat. This is a traditional Irish boat called a curragh, and I found it on the beach in parts, and I dragged it back to the studio and then rebuilt it. And I left it fractured between bow and stern. And I also found this perfect bird, a gannet, on the beach. Very unfortunately for the gannets, they fly very high and they dive for fish in the sea, and sometimes the sea is too shallow and they can't judge it and they break their necks. And I found him in very perfect fettle, and a man in County Sligo stuffed him for me. And we had him flying we inverted the curragh and had it upside down in the gallery, and then underneath it is the bird flying upside down. So it's a kind of it's the notion of the fractured culture of Ireland, which in some ways too is not dissimilar to anywhere, in that people are becoming more removed from the ocean. This connects back to a piece I'll show you later called Teacup, but also nature is upside down. So what you're having in terms of Selam's fracture and sadness around his ritual is in some ways being mirrored in this piece, which is to do in some sense with Ireland. Because wisdom is so tied in to nature in some sense. It is nature. And another piece in the corner, this was called Forge, and it was the same set of skulls but with the fetal skeleton just in a different position on this old anvil. And it's something that always interests me in terms of determined condition, or the choices we make in life, how we forge them for ourselves, they are forged for us, whether it's genetic, whether it's financial, whatever it is that drives us through in a way that makes us live in a certain way, that comes from the animal in us, but also comes from the imagination in us. But also even Lajos mentioning the goth, one is very conscious of using a skull in any form, a human skull, because of Halloween, etc. But it's terribly important, I think, more and more to try and look at one's own relationship with death, I guess, and our own structure, our own kind of, like looking at our skeleton in terms of our life. And it's not necessarily negative. It's about, in terms of the forging, it's about potential somehow more than a negativity. And these pieces, these are more poetic. Where my land is, foxgloves grow wild in the springtime, and they're beautiful big purple flowers. And what I made a piece in Dia a couple of years ago based on the notion of the foxglove. And in mythology, they were known as witches' fingers, and when we were kids we were told you should never stick your fingers into a foxglove and lick them because you would go blind. And in fact there's a semi-truth in that there's digitalis in a foxglove, which is used as a heart medicine, and if you are given too much digitalis you can start seeing in primary colours, blues and yellows. But in this particular case I cast the tips of a set of 5 fingers, and you can see here they read as the bells of the foxgloves. And very, very often people don't see the fingers at all, actually, which is kind of nice. But they're very, very hard to cast. It's back into sky. You have to dip them into the wax so that it's not too thick and it's not too thin. You don't shrivel the foxglove and you don't make it too lumpy. And then the actual flower is burnt out in the lost wax process in the foundry. So you only have one flower. There's no such thing as a mold or anything else. And this piece was a guillemot. It's a seabird that unfortunately died too. One kid came into my studio one day and said, "Everything's dead in here." And she was right, actually. But I kind of think in some ways it's some kind of, giving them a second chance, a bit like the Cow's Udders in the old days. But this piece is a music stand that I found in a junk shop. And another thing I always find in terms of nature and culture, and I recently made a trip to the Galapagos Islands with my friend Fiona Shaw, who's an actor, and I was sent by the Gulbenkian to make a piece of work about being there. And it was one of the most difficult things I ever did in my life, and we both came to the conclusion that you shouldn't. In some sense, you shouldn't make art about the Galapagos. The Galapagos is this strange little island of extraordinary, intense nature that's been destroyed very rapidly by us humans. And it felt to both of us that it was inappropriate to create. We used what was there in our final piece, but we didn't try and make anything new from it in a funny way. But what this is doing is challenging the notion of the human attempt to make music, because you look at a bird and they're extraordinary, and nothing in some ways can be more extraordinary than nature. But this poor fellow's pinioned into the music stand. And this one was a little movie screen that my father used to show us home movies on, with a gannet flying up in front of it. In the same show of Sapiens, I used photographs to do with the relationship between the human and the animal, like little Lara with the whalebone, or this fishmonger in Cork who caught this poor beagle shark, and a friend of mine used the meat for his restaurant, and then I got the skin, and we got him to skin him, which he did very brutally. And this whale came onto the shore near my house, and all the scientists rush onto the whale and they disembowel them and give them autopsies, and it's terribly kind of brutal. And kids even carved graffiti into the skin of the whale. So you have this very strange relationship to this dead animal in a way, and this kind of strange human claiming. And this was the shark that we caught down in New Ireland. They eat them. They catch them to eat. It is ritualized, but it's very much about food. Oh, this was a show in Frith Street Gallery in London that was actually happened a little bit before Sapiens, but it was around the same idea. And this gannet, this was the first gannet I ever found, and I attached him to a parachute, and it was very, very simply the collision between the human inability to fly and the bird's ability to fly. And what was lovely about the parachute was it was blue. You know, they're used by the army, I think, so that you can't see them on good days or something. And then the gannet's beak was just a tiny bit off the bottom of the floor. And this was my studio. Very sadly, birds fly into the windows, at intervals. And he left a smudge on the window, this thrush, and the smudge was there for ages, and it really upset me. And I took a photograph of the smudge, and then had it printed on acetate on glass, so that in fact, and called it thrush drawing. So the whole gallery was full of these besides the parachute, very small pieces. This is called Family, and I actually love this piece. This was 3 dried spider crabs that I found in a lobster pot, and they were completely desiccated. So a friend of mine made a mold, and they were like 15-part molds. So it's mummy crab, daddy crab, and baby crab. And daddy has a big penis on his back. And what I love about crabs, they're exoskeletal. You know, they're crustaceans, so their skeleton is on the outside and their flesh is on the inside. But the kind of absurd notion of making a family out of a relationship out of these animals that I kind of loved, but also going way back to my early work, whereas about looking at the penis in some ways as a vulnerable element, because I've always felt it is, but in this case it's like some kind of canon. But again, if he's exoskeletal, it's an absurd notion of kind of protective device for daddy. But and this was another one I did with a little Lara's finger on the right hand side. It's actually a little Lara's finger cast in silver attached to a crab. And this was my mother was when she got married, her father gave her a present of this travel case. And it's all ivory and silver, and it's almond oil and, you know, hairbrushes and thimbles and curling tongs. It's extraordinary. And it's made out of crocodile skin. And she gave it to me, and I had it lying around for ages. But she was Kinmonth when she was her maiden name, but she became Cross when she got married. So C is engraved on all these things. So I just put the crab in there. I cast the crab and silver plated him. So he just sits there. C is for crab as well. And this is a piece that I, again, found on the beach. It was a sheep who unfortunately got her head stuck in a lobster pot. And at the time, I was invited to go and do a lecture down in St. Petersburg, Florida, in Salvador Dali Museum. And I thought, oh God, I don't really like Salvador Dali. But the next day I went for a walk on the beach, and I found this, and I went, this is completely Salvador Dali. So I phoned the man up and I said, I'll do the lecture. So I pulled the lobster pot with the smelly old sheep up onto the rocks and let it decay. Now these are not great slides, but we showed this in the show on Frith Street and called it Wrong Death. So I waited till the skull was completely dried and then had it silver plated by people in England and put the skull almost like a reliquary into the lobster pot and just had it lying there. And this piece was called Salve. It's not a great slide, but in Goethe's house in Weimar, which is a very beautiful house if you're ever in Germany, you should visit, inlaid into the plank inside his front door is the word Salve, which is this wonderfully kind of strange lettering. It's kind of uneven. It looks like they made mistakes. So I found that piece of wood floating in the water, and I got this wonderful man who inlays wood called Ben Russell to inlay this black bog oak into this throwaway piece of wood. Because that's the other thing, that relationship between these things that are of no value and that I find very interesting. And salve is a salutation. Initially they use it kind of as slang, say, how are you? But it's also like some kind of reclamation of something that is of no value is interesting in a refocusing in some ways. And you know, I know I'm not an academic, and I'm quite conscious here that I should be maybe applying that notion of, you know, strangers from the deep, which might make more sense at the end of this thing. But there is something about, you know, familiarity and that is so corrupting in a way. And maybe, and I think Robin and Richard know me well enough that I speak very much, I never write anything down, as you can tell from this lecture. So sometimes it makes sense when it comes out of my mouth, but the value of art is its strangeness. And, you know, the quote by Baudelaire saying that beauty is always strange is, I think, fantastic. But art, by its nature, should be strange. Because if it's familiar, it's in no way going to engage us with anything. But there's this determination to make everything familiar in this world that is so frightfully conventional and upsetting. And I wonder, is it my aging, or is it actually the world that is becoming more and more conventional and further and further away from strangeness? And yet going back to that first image of, you know, the strangeness of our existence, but then the lack of strangeness of our behavior and our fear of it. You know, we could talk all night about fear around that. And the title of this whole set of lectures that Richard is doing, Hosting the Stranger, it's, you know, even that we have to consider that is really sad, because that's where excitement lies, in difference, and yet we're so removed from that, generally speaking, I think. Anyway, this is going back. I'm going to show you just a little run of slides here of different objects, because the crystallization of an object when it works can be lovely. This is a piece called Passion Bed, which I knitted all this wire together way back in the 80s and got 30 glasses that were this kind of urine coloured glass, and engraved onto them 30 different species of shark that are known to have attacked man without provocation. And this connects back to the piece we showed in the Gone Show called Slippery Slope. But the notion of passion bed too is that it's spent, and the danger of passion, which again is very highly charged with strangeness. this is the spent notion of that, so that the glass is no longer possible to drink out of, because it's hard to see here, but when I sandblasted the perfect shapes of the sharks, it burst through the glass, so it's no longer able to hold the liquid. So it's almost like the mattress that's been contaminated or blasted away. This was called Kitchen Table, and it had the same 30 species of shark burnt into the surface of the table, and a little enamel bowl that your granny might make her brown bread in, and underneath this kind of curved structure that had a glass test tube full of fossilized shark's teeth that I got, that actually come from America somewhere in some riverbed. This was a kiss, and I did a piece called Strangers on a Train, and I cast the kiss between two people's mouths. So when you put in this dental plaster into your mouth and you kissed somebody and you pushed your tongue intensely and your lips to them, you end up with this palate, and the hole that occurs is where the lips push the plaster out of the way. So the hole is the point of most intense touching and passion. So the loss is the kiss in some sense. This was a little set which was based on the notion of the convention of marriage in a way, which is it's the backs of two cuttlefish bones. It's a very ancient system of casting precious metal. And what I did was I got two rings and cast them. You impress the ring into the bone of the cuttlefish that you have in budgies cages and everything else, and then you make a little channel and you pour in your molten gold. But this was about the impossibility of wearing those rings. The rings are cast between two animals, but you end up with this little abstract thing that is impossible to wear. And this is a beautiful thing I found under the water in Ireland a couple of years ago. I was diving in the fjord up the road, and it's an old whiskey bottle where these tube worm colonies grew around the bottle. And it's like Botticelli's Venus or something. It's just so, I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And I went back down with my dive buddy, and I put a camera down there and a plate and knives and forks, and I tied them into the tube worm colonies, hoping that these things would grow. But the storm, a diver brought up one of them, and then the storm washed them all away. But that kind of beautiful relationship between nature and culture and something like that. And this piece was a friend of mine went up to the Arctic, and he said, what would you like as a present? And I said, I knew he ate walruses, so it was all about subsistence up there. So I said, bring back a whisker of a walrus. So he brought back this whisker, and there was kind of the residue of blood in it. They're very hard things. And this was a thimble belonging to my grandmother, so I just drilled a hole in the thimble and attached the whisker, which is very much about the notion of touch and sensitivity with the walrus, and the removal from touch with the thimble. So again, in some ways it's about fear, or removal from our natural touch. A Bible with a hole in it. This was a Bible that was in the attic. I didn't know what to do with it, decided to drill a hole in it. Literally, and this is where I rely on my academic friends, or analysis. You go to your shrink and you say, why did I drill a hole in that? And they tell you. This was in the days I went to a shrink. But I actually opened it at this page, and I showed it to a friend of mine, and I said, why did I do this? It was very, very hard to do to begin with, technically very hard. And I did it really well. There were no tears or anything. And I opened it at this page, and my friend James said, but of course you know why you've done this. The whole lands of the hearts of the two Marys. These women were in love with Jesus. He, at this point in time, had just gone up into heaven and from the tomb when he came, and at that point, his body becomes spirit, and it's a disconnection from body. And what in effect has happened here is that the hole, or the void, has landed where the hearts of these two women are. So I have reinvested some physicality into the Bible, but it's through loss also. You've lost the body of Jesus, and it's become spirit, which is, as a Catholic in Ireland, you really feel that, because you're removed from the body in terms of teaching and told it's bad. So it became this kind of glory hole in the Bible, and it didn't actually destroy the Bible. You could still read it. It was not a vandalism. It was very controlled. And these snakes, again, maligned creatures that I got from a scientific supplier in North Carolina. And when I was gutting them, I found their hearts and was struck by that, stupidly. And they're like little kidney beans. So I put them into these little silver reliquaries, and had entwined the snakes as if they were being tenderly in love with each other, and called it lover snakes. And then I moved studios about every 5 years, and this was an old power station I worked in where I started working with cow's udders. And I was there for about 4 years. And in the early 90s, I started working with udders. I had seen a sieve in northern Norway made out of a cow's udder, a utilitarian object, and I thought it was fantastically surreal and fascinating and wonderful. So I came back to Ireland and accessed udders, skinning the cows upside down. The cows were being skinned for leather. They were old cows. But normally speaking, the cow is skinned, ripped down the middle, and the udder is destroyed, so it had to happen the other way around. This piece was called Amazon, the title implying mystery in some sense, but also referring to the Amazonian warriors who were more adept at shooting bows and arrows because they cut off one breast. And it was focusing on the nipples, the teats, and at the time I was working on them, I was reading a lot about cows, and one of the articles I read said the darkest place in the world is the inside of a cow. And it was about milk production or something. It was a very strange kind of approach. But and the size of udders were so terribly, terribly important. But what I was interested in was that when I saw the sieve in Norway was that it gave the cow another use. She wasn't only this docile thing being milked, and that somehow that she was being resurrected in the imagination into some other territory. So the Amazon referred to, fashion, the Amazonian warriors, but also she only had one single teat. And when you looked at it close up, it was very like the tip of a penis. So it went into very Freudian territory then and became quite simple and obvious. But very peculiar, and getting back to the notion of strange. And I even felt they were very strange in the beginning, and I used to hide them because of fear, actually. And I remember some of the technicians, and I used to work in the old power station, they'd come in and I'd kind of cover them in a sheet. And because of the feeling that you were mutating something unnaturally in a funny way, and yet you could do that in a painting with paint or whatever, but actually to use the material itself, it's much more of a taboo area. In the 50s and 60s, pregnant women were told they should drink more Guinness and that it would make them healthy. So this piece was a Guinness bottle I found in the power station, and I just stuck a teat on top of it. But it was also, that was also about obliteration, the need to drink Guinness to be intoxicated, which is black, and then the overlap between the white of the milk. And I thought it was a very, very simple piece, and the nurture of the nipple, because these pieces are not about denying nurture or the milk-giving thing. It's about that overlap between two territories. The phallic, therefore, possibly powerful, and the nurture of the breast. This piece is called Ladle, and it had one little teat. And Life Boy, where you had two notions of life support, the nipple and the Life Boy, and a pillow. And this piece was the end of the other series, where I got a pair of knickers and stitched a teat into the gusset. And it was the only piece that was very definitely placing the teat in the genital area. But to try and kind of tone it down, I put in a trunk in the show, so that you had to go and look into the trunk. And you weren't too sure whether someone had thrown them away because they were disgusted by them, or that they were leaving them there for future use. And it was fantastic, the different responses. Like an old aunt of mine spent ages looking, and then came up and said, "Well, that's life," and just walked away, I thought, where's she been? But and then, a psychoanalyst friend of mine came and went on and on and on about Freud and blah, blah, blah. And then this other guy came and said, well, you can buy things like that in New York sex shops that are inverted kind of penises and rubber knickers, which I didn't know about. But that was the swan song to the cow's teat. I didn't do any more after that. It was kind of like you couldn't, I suppose. It was the end. Are we doing all right on time? Yeah. This is a little piece that's very kind of personal in a way. These were little chiffon kerchiefs that my grandmother wore, and I happened to come upon pieces of skull from another aunt who was a pathologist. And I drilled 4 little holes in the pieces of skull and made buttons and stitched them into the middle of the chiffon scarves using the same colour thread and called them skull buttons. Because my grandmother is now long dead, but you know, they did use animals' bones for years and years and years for buttons, and you know, mother of pearl and all the rest of it. But it was along that line, I suppose, dragging us into that same territory. This is a piece that I thought I had to put in because it's about a wonderful woman who lived a very unusual life called Maud de Lapp. She lived on Valentia Island in County Kerry, and in 1902 she succeeded in breeding jellyfish in her father's house. She was not trained as a scientist, she was an amateur naturalist. Years later she got awarded by the Linnaean Society, honoured by them at the end of her life, which was fantastic because she had done such extraordinary work. But myself and my brother Tom, who's a zoologist, were funded by the Wellcome Trust to make a film which we call Medusae, which is the Latin for the plural of jellyfish, Medusa, which is a fabulous word. And this is Maud in the middle between her 2 sisters, Mary and Connie. They were the 3 daughters left over from a Victorian family who were married off. The sons became ministers or went to war. 1 or 2 girls married, and then there were 3 women who didn't marry, who were left living in a big old house on their own with very little money. But they found a Cuvier's whale and photographed it on a table in their garden. And weirdly, the one that I showed in the beginning was a Cuvier's whale, and they're quite rare whales. But beautiful the way they set it up to take the photographs. So myself and my brother decided we'd try and make a film that was, and it's an awkward, weird, kind of hybrid little documentary we made that is half about the memory of Maud and trying to look at the facts we know about her life and not fictionalise her, and half about the swimming techniques of a jellyfish who lives in Australia called Chironex fleckeri, that's the most deadly animal on the planet, and is very prevalent on the east coast of Australia. And if you've been there, you've probably noticed that for 6 months of the year you're not allowed to swim, you have to swim in nets, but they're very little spoken about. But Maud, in her life, only ever came to Dublin once, which would have been maybe a 6-hour trip, but she sent specimens to the Natural History Museum in Dublin, which is this wonderful building, Victorian building. This is her whale skull, after she sent it up from the table. And she also found a turtle and put it live on a train from County Kerry. It's a little one over there on the far side. And the letter sent back to her saying, "Dear Mr. Lapp, we thank you very much for the turtle, but unfortunately we had to kill it." And that's the turtle there. And these are wonderful. There's a research of that. You know, at that time there was a great, there were an awful lot of Victorian ladies who, studied dragonflies and stars and jellyfish and things like this. And a curiosity, because curiosity is another thing that you could make a whole new series of things about. But these were glass jellyfish made by the Blaschkas in Germany around the same time. Well, a little bit earlier than Maud, I guess. And they're extraordinary. Like the technical ability of those men, Rudolf and his son, I can't remember his name, are extraordinary. And so then I went down to Palau in Micronesia to film jellyfish because I knew we mightn't get enough footage. And we got a lot of footage there, and then we came back to Australia and we had to try and film these jellyfish swimming in a straight line. It was very funny because very difficult. We did a lot of that technical stuff with my brother, and most of the time they wouldn't behave. And then actually, Ritesh, I might go on to the next video. This is a video called Jellyfish Lake, which Robin referred to, which was a very simple notion. When I was filming, I'll talk about it maybe in a sec. I'll just show you about a minute of it. Yeah, that's it. That's great, thanks.
You don't have to rush, you can take time.
Oh, really? Am I rushing?
No, not at all. I'm just saying if you want to show more than
Okay.
because it's kind of intriguing.
What happened when we were there was I went with a friend of mine from New York who travels a lot with me, and we were both filming. We'd take the camera 15 minutes each. It was paradise. It's an archipelago of islands in Micronesia, Palau, and it's only about 10,000 years ago, these limestone islands were uplifted and kind of trapped these lakes in the middle. So very recent ecosystems. And the only animals that live there are jellyfish and a tiny species of small kind of sprat-like fish. And so when we were filming, I noticed what was happening with the jellyfish around my friend. So I asked him to shoot them around my hair. And this was a particular, thank you, that's great. I'll go back to this slide. This is a kind of thing when you're making art where sometimes there's a very immediate image that you know you have to do nothing to it. It's completely there without having to do anything. Whereas making Medusae with my brother, we had to edit, we had to look for information. This was this kind of poetic thing that I had never seen before. The jellyfish didn't sting. It wasn't about some awful masochistic thing. It was about some strange, beautiful kind of lyrical relationship between an animal that normally people run a million miles away from. Maybe instinctively because, you know, jellyfish can kill you, but also through kind of not understanding. And they live in a realm that we're not used to being in. And most people, I suppose, don't have access to seeing them in their beauty underwater. And when you're with them underwater, they are so extraordinarily beautiful. But what happened with that kind of navigation of the jellyfish, it would look like the jellyfish was curious and around my neck. But one problem I always have, and Robin never does it, is talking about anthropomorphizing, because I think there's a difference in what I'm trying to do in relationship to animal, and I don't think I'm necessarily trying to humanize the animal. It's more about looking at the interconnectedness, I guess, really. And another branch that came from this was that back home in Ireland, this is a species called Chrysora isosceles, which is a compass jellyfish, and they're very common along the coast in the summer. And they give you a tiny sting, not much. But my brother mentioned that jellyfish is 98% water and 2% animal. And you see them on the beach desiccating. So I tried to take them and put them on linen, these napkins and sheets that belonged to my grandmother, and dry them. And they go through a kind of disgusting process. Some of them rot. Some of them that I found on the beach were full of sand. But essentially what you get is a drawing of the jellyfish, or the kind of shroud of Turin of jellyfish. And this was one on a sheet, a linen sheet that we lit from the back and took a photograph of. So it was kind of nature drawing itself. Chiasm. Chiasm, this is a natural phenomenon, this thing. This is a pool out on the Aran Islands on the west coast of Ireland. And I think it's one of the wonders of the world. It's about 100 feet long and 30 feet wide. And the sea comes in underneath and rises up and down. So it's tidal. And there it is in bad weather. It's a really, really miraculous place. It's again limestone, and the limestone has subsided and created these perfectly machine-like walls. And I was invited to make a piece of work when this art centre was being knocked down and rebuilt, and the man who ran it, Fiach McNeil, who's very kind of inspiring, said, would you like to do a project kind of anywhere? And so I said, let's try and do something here. And we went out and we filmed the pool from 360 degrees on a crane. And what I was interested in was the kind of geometry of it in a way, its perfect proportions. And I realized that the proportions are very, very similar to the proportions of these handball alleys, which exist all around Ireland, which are concrete alleys where they play the sport called handball. Now they do it indoors, but in the 50s and 60s, there were like 400 of them around Ireland, and it was very, very popular. Now they stand kind of empty, a bit like Saul Lewitt sculptures, full of kind of drunks and things like that, and unfortunately are getting knocked down one by one. But they're very beautiful places. So I got permission from the school to use these two alleys. There were two built against two. And we painted the floors white, and the scale of the floor is very similar to the scale of the Paul na Baish, the worm's hole, the pool. Paul na Baish is Irish for, literally translated as like the hole of the beast, but in English they call it the wormhole, that rectangular pool. So then I got two singers, a soprano and a tenor, and I put one in each alley, and we built a kind of a railing scaffolding where people could stand, so that if you were standing on this side you saw the tenor and heard him more clearly. If you stood on the other side you heard the soprano. And I went off for a couple of months on a residency and listened to about 40 different operas about romantic love, and extricated phrases from those in different languages from different operas, in the end from about 10 different operas. And the singers sang them in the different alleys on top of projections of the pool. And I'll show you a little video clip of this in a moment. But this was very much about, it was about relationship and lack of relationship. The same videos were mirrored exactly on either side of the wall. So the singers were walking on exactly the same thing, just inverted. I choreographed the music, but not them in a way, in that I tried to work the phrases, both in English, French, German, Russian. In the beginning, they start singing. She starts singing Ein schönes War, what a wonderful thing love is, from Ariadne of Naxos. He comes in and sings Donna non vide mai from Manon Lescaut. And they're independent of each other, and they're not relating to each other. But they're standing on these whirling landscapes of this pool, which is surging, almost like in this kind of a passionate way, I guess, in and out of the pool. Then they come to a point where they sing a duet from Romeo and Juliet, where they're saying adieu, adieu, de cet adieu, goodbye, parting is such sweet sorrow, basically. But then they start singing the same fragments of music, more fragmented, and end singing where they began, but the music was on top of itself. So we didn't actually musically mess around with it at all. There was no orchestra, so their voices were singing without any support of all those beautiful orchestral instruments. So they became much more vulnerable. And every night they did it 3 times. It was about 20 minutes long. So, and I told them just to walk as they felt, so we didn't choreograph them. And there was a chance that they might meet, like Pyramus and Thisbe, at one point in the wall during the entire night, but they never ever did. In the 3 nights we did it. Could you run that, Ritesh, actually? I'll just play, just to show you how the sound works. It's chiasm B, it's 5B there. I think one thing that I loved about the title of that was given to me by someone who understood the word chiasm, which comes from a physiological term, I think, where 2 lines intersect, and what is mirrored on either side of that. And it's used architecturally. There's a museum in Finland called Kiasma. But what I loved about it was that notion of architectural connection, the natural connection between the pool and the pulsation of the water, and then the connection between the 2 humans. But it's all structured, but it never, each time you saw it, and each night you could go and you could watch it 3 times if you wanted to. And because you only had one perspective each time, every time you saw it was completely different. Also because the singers walked on it differently each time. There was never an exact replication of it, which is something I love about both looking at art and about art itself. It's like how you how you consider Mona Lisa today and how you consider it tomorrow. It's completely different. And that is something that's terribly difficult to hold on to, which also gets back to that notion of strangeness, which all ties in completely in terms of relationship, in love and passion, because how do you hold that notion of desire? And that Robin is an expert speaking about this piece. You should be speaking about this piece, and that impossibility. But which in the wormhole, in that pool, the tide comes in every day and relates differently to the containment of the stone. Equally, we relate differently and in relationship to the containment of our shells or our bodies. So it's something that I don't know, that uncertainty, again, I suppose I'm getting back to uncertainty, is something that I find extremely desirable. I say that, in terms of art, maybe. Now, what's next? Oh, I probably should have shown you this before I showed you Chiasm. This was the first video work I ever did, which was called Teacup, and it's normally shown on a tiny screen, so the teacup is the size of the actual teacup. And I borrowed 3 minutes from a famous film called Man of Arran, which was made on the same Aran Islands in the 30s by an Irish-American director called Robert Flaherty, who made some wonderful films. And it's a little scene of a little curragh boat, which you saw earlier with the gamut under it, in a storm, going round and round and round and crashing. And it's, again, in some ways this is very simple, a bit like Jellyfish Lake, I guess, in that you're talking about something that is very civilized and safe in terms of the teacup, relating to something that is very uncivilized and unsafe. But it's also about a kind of a colonization, and for me this piece was probably primarily about that, in that it's the notion of tea and tea drinking being very British. The life on the Aran Islands being very untouched in terms of its isolation when it was invaded by the British. It existed culturally really because there was nothing there for the English that they needed. But now that life is being undermined, again through fear and of nature really. You can't go out in your curragh in case you fall in and drown. You can't carry a school bag in case you pull your back. And all that kind of desperate kind of prohibition of relationship to nature that's occurring. But the teacup, the politeness too of the teacup in relationship to the wildness is something that I kind of liked about that piece. And this was a trip that I made to Antarctica. These are stills from a video. I won't show you the actual video, but I went down there really on a holiday to the Antarctic Peninsula, and I brought an underwater camera. And I took this footage and I came back to Ireland, and I just looked at it and I thought, God, you carry that big heavy camera and it's really not very interesting. It's kind of blue and it's not as good as Discovery Channel. And so I left it in the can for a long time, and then with the guy I worked with, I said, flip it into black and white and we'll see what it looks like. But then it looked like Ernest Shackleton. So then, no, I said, we can't do that. So then I said, this was such a trick, in a funny way, a bit like a trick, a bit like casting the kiss. The casting of the kiss was ABC, how can we cast a kiss? And it is about you using kind of tricks. But what happened when we turned it into negative became incredibly beautiful. Because when you're down there, it is quite extraordinarily strange to be surrounded by icebergs that are nearly as big as high-rises in Manhattan. You come in through the fog and these things float past you. And you're aware it's incredibly perilous and melting in front of your eyes. So what happened when you went into the negative and when we went scuba diving is we were wearing all this black gear and we were against these icebergs. So when you put it into black and white negative, you start getting these glowing, almost toxic figures in this landscape that becomes very strangely kind of undermined in a way, which is kind of and perilous, I guess. And this happened around the same time. You know, where I live, I find things on the shore, and I keep finding these bits of old rubber fins and boots and things. And there was a sound technician in my studio one day who had webbed toes. So I cast his foot, and I patinated them in. They were cast in bronze and then patinated. Now that's actually my foot. But what I was interested in terms of discovering the residue of the old bits of rubber fins and bits of boots is that, again, getting back to us, you know, the residue of us, you know, like the skull button or you don't find a body on the beach, a human body. But actually in the Galapagos, they found this desiccated body on the beach in the very early days of Galapagos. They have photographs of this man all dried up. But what I felt in terms of these pieces is that what you get when you cast the foot, that's a little boy's foot, is it's almost like you've taken your skin off, like you take your fin off, so that the foot becomes almost like a shoe. The skin is just a closer shoe to your skeletal structure in a way. That's the sound technician's webbed toes. They're fantastic. He had sandals on, and I saw them. They're completely webbed. But this piece then is called Ghost Ship. Date-wise, I'm jumping all around the place. This was back in 1999, and this was a public project I did in the Museum of Modern, in conjunction with the Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, where they asked artists to put in ideas to make a project within the Dublin Bay area that would last for just 3 weeks. And my father, we used to live by the sea for 3 months every year, and my father took a photograph of this boat in the 1930s. And I then found the same boat strapped to a quay in Dublin, quite derelict, and discovered that it was the same boat that my father had filmed or photographed. And my father used to bring us out there when we were kids as a treat, because there were men that lived on these boats. There were lightships that were moored to the reefs underwater that couldn't build lighthouses on. So they were basically floating lighthouses. And there were about 27 of them around Ireland, which were decommissioned in the 70s. And in fact, the last one was decommissioned about a month ago. And now they put satellite buoys that have no human beings living on them. So basically, when I found the boat that was in Dublin Bay, it had been given by the Commissioners of Irish Lights to these Sea Scouts. And the Sea Scout man, I phoned him up and I said, if I get this project, will you lend me your ship? And he said yes, which was very good of him. And they were painted red, and the name of the rock that they sat over was always painted in giant big Barbara Kruger type letters on the side of the ship. And this particular ship was built in Glasgow in 1928. Fantastic, 128 feet long, beautiful brass lamp up on the top, and about 13 or 14 men lived on them for 3 weeks on and 3 weeks off, maintaining the lamp. And what we did basically was we painted the ship with phosphorus paint to try and create a ghost. And it was moored in Dublin Bay, and each night we had to build a structure of UV lamps on it, because it needed to be pumped up with UV, because there wasn't enough sunlight really in Ireland to guarantee that it would glow. So we had this sequence where it would be pumped by light for 15 minutes and then it would glow and pumped and glow. But it was always at its most beautiful at the end of the night when the lights went out and it just went into this absolute fading. Actually, Ritesh, could you run this one? I have a little bit of, now it's quite, it might be hard to see. It's down again. Number 8. Next one. There, yeah, great. It was at its most beautiful when you were right up next to it, actually. We were told we weren't allowed to sail around it, but we used to always go out at night and kind of go around it in boats. The camera found it very hard to read the phosphorus. It was very tricky to film. But this piece, you know, in some ways, my father's dead a long time. This was very much in tune. You know, I felt very much this was a piece. To me, it was a terribly simple idea. Terribly difficult thing to do. We ran into awful bureaucracy and it almost didn't happen. But it was probably, in some respects, the the only piece of work I've ever done that didn't need any question whatsoever. It was almost about fantasy, you know, because I think every culture in the world and every person has some notion of a ghost ship. So I even found that people didn't even need to see it, which was kind of funny. You could imagine it, you know. I think that's it. Yeah, thanks. Getting back to other animals and the lover snakes. The only other piece I ever did was a snake, and this is hard to read, but I rented a snake and brought it to my studio, and we filmed him coming down a 6-meter long plastic pipe. And what happened was, in the end, we showed the video in a hole in the wall that was only the same diameter as the pipe. And so you had this thing that appeared almost like an eye and took 9 minutes to emerge. And eventually, actually what happened when we were filming him, he loved being in the middle and he stayed there. We had to poke about with the stick and put him back in again. But he really liked being in the tube. He was a black Russian snake. But in the end, what he does is, you have this thing that, like a pupil of the eye, that moves very, very, very slowly and then emerges and slides out the end of the tube. And I showed it in a way in relationship to this door. So that's it over on the far side, where you have this little hole that is very obscure and strange, almost like some kind of plug hole or something. And then the door was just a door I had in my flat where I drilled many, many holes, and brings in that thing of kind of vulnerability, but it's no longer a protective thing. But what I loved about the snake, that in some ways tied into a piece I made called Eye Maker, where a man makes this eyeball, is you had this strange relationship between what most people considered was an eye that then turns into a snake. I'm throwing in a lot of mixed stuff here, but the work tends to do that. This was a piece called Figure, and it was a little video piece that I made. We got permission to film outside the Customs House in Dublin, which is a very lovely building by Gandon. And we filmed it at 5 o'clock in the morning, on a summer's morning, and shut off the traffic and everything. And a friend of mine, I got to dive. There are these ladders on the edge of these granite walls along the river in Dublin. And for some reason, they're painted white on either side of the ladder. I think it must be for people who fall in accidentally or suicidally, who might want to climb back up again. So it kind of shows them where the ladder is. But so that is actually there, that white mark. So I got my brave friend to come and dive from the ladder into the river. Now the Customs House is kind of Customs and Excise, and it stands for kind of the institution of kind of accepting or rejecting. So what I was trying to do with this piece, which was commissioned very much for the centre of Dublin, was to take a human being and put them in this position in front of this edifice where they dive naked into this river. And what he did was he'd go in, he'd come up, and then he'd wait for a moment and he'd climb back up again. And in the video, you saw him doing this 3 or 4 times. But then the 5th time, the camera goes into the splash and you don't actually see him coming out again. So you don't know what he's chosen. Has he chosen between the regimen of the authority of the urban edifice or nature? Has he chosen, obliteration or some kind of absorption? Has he swum off frame? There was nothing certain about it. But also the strangeness of the naked man doing this kind of ritualistic, kind of repetitive action was kind of beautiful in its own way. I'm coming close to the end here now, but I didn't bring anything to show you of the Galapagos work. I made a show in the end called Stage that we put in a church where Charles Darwin used to go with his mother until he was 8 years old, and it's his bicentenary this year. But when myself and Fiona were in Galapagos, I found this room full of bones that was all locked up in the Darwin Research Centre, and it's fantastic. It's just the most beautiful thing in the world. Like, that whale is 40 foot long, and it was like, the most beautiful artwork you could come across anywhere, and it's full of dust. And we went in there every day, and she would read poems. And the film that I made ends with her that's her there next to the whale, reading. She's fantastically academic and informed about, she can quote from The Tempest, from everything. She's worked a lot as a Shakespearean actress. So we ended up with her reading a text by Emily Dickinson about abdication. And in a sense, I think what we're trying to do with it was talking about a human abdication from the situation of the Galapagos, but also a kind of cultural abdication, because essentially it feels like a crime to even try to make anything when you're surrounded by a 300-year-old tortoise's breath. It just silences everything else, and maybe art can only happen in situations that are I'm thinking this more and more, unnatural, which is our heads in one sense, because we're so malinformed or informed, but also the way we live in the modern world, and the strangeness of the isolation that has occurred through attempting not to be isolated, and all this. I'm finding the modern world more and more confusing, I think, because I go to the beach and I see this, which is tragic. It's a sperm whale that has landed on the beach, but then you see this, where the little girl with the dog. So then the two photographs I show is the whale on its own on the beach and the whale on the beach with the girl and the dog. So the whale exists despite the fact that the girl and the dog are there. And I'm very interested in that point between the two things, of presence or absence, but equally of the excitement of something and being able to hold on to that. And maybe that's where art is terribly important, and the need for new art. It's interesting. The music possibly works in a different way. You can disagree or agree on this one, but it's so emotive music that when you hear it again, its capillaries or something work in a different way. There's something about art. Also, maybe it's something to do with the fact that it's made usually by an individual person, that another individual comes and looks at it, they relate to it in a certain way, and then maybe it's not important anymore. And that whole thing of collecting and buying and maintaining forever is not important. It's only about that instantaneous moment. This is a photograph I took outside my house one night when people drown, which doesn't happen very often, thankfully. Helicopters come and search for them. And I just took this tiny snap, and it was so exquisite in a way, and sinister, but this helicopter was going up and down, lighting the sea, searching for what turned out, in this particular case, to be some boy from up the coast who had had a fight with his father, and he hadn't drowned at all. He'd gone to the pub, and the helicopter was going up and down, spending thousands of pounds looking for the body. But I think I love these images because it's hard to see them a bit in this light. They're very black when you see them in real life. They're actually photographs. It is, it's about that thing of expectancy, and like if it found something, then you're into a whole other territory. But it's about the search in a way, So, and maybe that's what I'm trying to talk about in terms of when you found it, is it over, completely? And I think I have two more, this, and then I'll show you one video. I was out in the wormhole this summer because we were filming I worked on an opera in English National Opera called Riders to the Sea, and we used this pool as part of our theatre set for the Coliseum. But I got into the pool and just lay there. And the scale, it shows you the scale, but it also, for me, in some ways, epitomizes we're all born into this world, and we're all confined in a certain way. Whatever you are, even if you're an astronaut, you're confined. But that somehow, at the same time as being confined, there's the fact of the ocean here and the strangeness of the ocean, the fact that something can come in from outside and that it moves in so many different ways, is that despite the containment, it's about multiple possibility as well, and that's enough to be excited, I think. So it is conflict between everything being possible and nothing being possible. It's somewhere between those two territories. And there's one little video, which thank you very much for doing this. I'll show you this. It's only a minute long, and it was an accident that happened in my studio, and then we showed it in a little room in Darwin's. Darwin's mother was a Unitarian, a free thinker, and she brought him to this little church in Shrewsbury every Sunday until he was 8, and then she died, actually. But it had all these fantastically little polite English rooms, meeting rooms and tea rooms and things. And down again, yeah. Oop. But this particular piece, Ossicle, we put in a little meeting room on a flat screen, and you see now. So that's it. Thanks very much, Joshua.